Hi class, social problems, chapter 9, problems labeled deviance. Deviance is something that we all should know something about. None of us abide by all the rules. Some of us, we probably don't break the law, but we bend it every time we get in our cars and we drive. Deviance is a problem in our society. But deviance can also be functional for society. There are people like Emil Durkheim, the structural functionalists, that believe that with deviance, it reinforces the rules of society. Deviance is, by definition, the violation of societal norms. Some of these norms are formal, some are informal. Some of them you may just get sort of an unpleasant look, a slap on the wrist, or you may be incarcerated or even receive the death penalty for the violation of some norms like murder in society. There is no deviance without norms. So the deviance reinforces the fact that there are rules within society. It's very interesting that many times we don't really understand the nature of society until we violate these laws and these rules within society. There's an experiment called a breaching experiment where you intentionally violate a rule. Some of you will see this on YouTube and on shows where they have pranksters that would do something, and you would find out just how fragile our society is and our relationships are and our interactions are when these norms are violated within society. Norms are patterns of acceptable behavior in our society. And these norms can begin very subjectively, just simply a person has a habit. That habit becomes characteristic of who the person is, and people say, there you go again. Eventually, people began to imitate that particular habit, and people look at each other and they say, there we go again. And now you have a norm that takes on a group formation. And then you have norms that eventually are characteristic in society. After a while, they become objectified as if they're written in stone, as if they've always been there, and they influence our choices, what we think and what we do in society. Sociology provides a unique contribution to our understanding of deviance in society. We determine, one perspective is a determinist perspective on deviance. That deviance has always been there. It is inevitable in society. It constrains our behavior. We have very few choices, but we are at the mercy of phenomena like deviance in society, and we virtually have no choice. On the other hand, there are those that hold that we have what's known as free will, that deviance is a subjective reality. It's something that we socially define and we create in society, that deviance is not inevitable. Deviance is a matter of choice. It is not something that has the ability to determine our behavior, though it may inform our behavior. Labeling theory is an approach to deviance that looks at how we attach labels and social definitions to individuals and groups in society. And it doesn't matter whether a person has committed an act of deviance or not. That's not important. What's important is that we identify this person as criminal, as deviant, as delinquent in society. And guess what? It has the same consequences, because socially constructed reality, labels in society, have the same consequences as objective reality. Labels also can be resisted. There are some people that have a greater ability to resist labels, and others that have less of an ability to resist these labels. People with power and resources have the ability to have publicists and public relations and public affairs, people to go out and to talk about their character and how great they are, despite what they have done or have not done. And they have the ability to resist labels in that way. On the other hand, those people who are among the poor, minorities, women, have less of an ability to resist these labels because of their relative disadvantage within society. Labels can also result in a stigma. Stigma is a concept by Irving Goffman, who conducted his observation and analysis within an asylum, a mental institution. And he talked about how the idea of stigma can affect you in society. He also wrote a book called Presentations of Self in Everyday Life. He did a study of asylums, as I said, and how people are institutionalized. But this concept of stigma has to do with a label that has been internalized, and a person begins to identify themselves based upon that label. For example, a child. If you call a child dumb or stupid at a very early age, eventually the child will internalize that particular label and begin to see themselves as dumb and stupid and incapable of keeping up, of competing with the other kids, of performing well in school. All of those things becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and this label is internalized, and that person, it radically changes their self-concept and their identity. Once something has become a stigma, it is virtually impossible to resist it. It's virtually impossible to reverse the consequences of a stigma. There are also the concepts of primary and secondary deviance by Edwin Lamert. Primary deviance is the act of deviance itself, when a norm has been violated, like staring. If you stare at someone for over 3 seconds, you violated a norm. You violated someone's eye space. It can be interpreted as affection that may be wanted or unwanted, or it could be interpreted as aggression. But you have just violated a norm. It's an actual act of deviance. And some acts of deviance are just like that. They're subjective and they are not written down. Then there's secondary deviance. And it relates to a person's identity and self-concept, that a person begins to see themselves through the lens of a label, to see themselves as deviant, and they identify with the act. For example, there is the act of deviance, and then there is the concept of deviance that affects a person's identity, which is referred to as secondary deviance. Labels have consequences. Be careful what you call something. Be careful what you name something. Because in the social world, what we socially define and how we socially define things has consequences for people and for society, particularly when there are negative labels. These negative labels, we say that, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Words are very powerful things. Words can radically change a person's self-concept. People can react based upon a label, whether or not the label accurately reflects who a person is or what a person has done. For example, in the case of lynchings in the South, historically, if a person is labeled as a criminal, they were lynched. There was no due process of law. There was no right to face your accusers in a court of law. None of that was afforded you. All they said is that that person did it, string them up, and do not pass go, do not collect $200. It's done. So don't think of labels as something that is to be taken lightly, but labels are very, very powerful, and labels have real consequences for people. Members of the underclass and racial minorities, women, are more likely to be labeled deviant. On the other hand, people with power, with wealth and privilege are less likely. Labels serve the interest of people in power. Typically, people in power create the labels. They reinforce the labels. They are also responsible for the consequences of these labels in society. So labels do have real consequences. One form of deviance we talk about in sociology is homelessness. It's estimated that about 4 million people are homeless today, and over 1 million of them are children. There are many different explanations why people are homeless. There are social psychological factors. There are things that have to do with the individual, things within their power, their control. It is a choice that people make, and they are homeless and living on the streets or living in some other setting in society. Then we also have structural factors. For example, people can be homeless and it has more to do with the conditions within society than the choices that people are making. For example, plants close, companies relocate to different places, a person is fired from a job, all kinds of things change and in the structure and the institutions of society that may contribute to homelessness. All of the homeless are not the same. There was a typology that I read about, and it had to do with the difference between a hobo, a tramp, and a bum. A hobo is basically a migrant worker. The word hobo comes from ho boy. The ho is something you use in agriculture, and these are people that went from place to place looking for work. On the other hand, you have the tramp. The tramp moves from place to place, but only works if he has to. He works enough to get food. He works enough to get a drink. He works enough just for the day. He lives from day to day, but not really looking for work, but will work if he has to. A bum, on the other hand, will not work under any circumstances. They are more willing to look for a handout, to panhandle, to beg for food, to beg for money than they are to work. So these terms may not be flattering, but it is a typology that helps us understand the diversity of people that are among the homeless. What are some of the causes of homelessness? Unemployment, unaffordable housing, eminent domain. Under the Fifth Amendment, governments, municipalities have the power to take property and residences, and this renders people homeless. Revitalization programs, urban renewal, where cities are attempting to enhance the property values or to rezone an area, gentrification, where they try to rezone areas within a town, a city. And this has the effect of displacing people and contributes to the problem of homelessness. Another problem we address in sociology when it comes to deviance is mental illness. Mental illness is considered a form of deviance in society. Deviance is actually defined by what's known as the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which has all the symptoms of mental disorders and pathologies, fears, all of those things that are part of mental illness in society. We also have what's known as developmental disabilities that have to do with their physical disabilities, but there are developmental disabilities also that intersect with the problem of mental illness in society. It is a behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual. So it can be something that is psychological or something that is behavioral, could be considered mental illness. It reflects an underlying psychobiological dysfunction where people have some type of chemical imbalance in the body and it affects their behavior in some way. The consequences are clinically significant. Distress or disability, for example, in anxieties, in fears, in depression, all of these are consequences that fall under the category of mental illness, and must not be merely expected response to common stressors. It's just not like a reaction to something that is actually happening. For example, if you're walking across the street, a car is coming and you are run for your life, that is a normal response. But if you're walking down the street and you're afraid that something's going to fall on your head or afraid that you're going to be victimized, this is an anxiety. This is not a realistic fear. And so this is something that is not a common response to things within your environment. And also, they result in social deviance or conflicts with society. In society, everyone is expected to perform prescribed roles, and people with mental illness do not demonstrate the capacity to do so. So deviance is considered deviant from the norm within society. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. Deviance is not necessarily bad. It's just that it's different from the norm in society. And so we don't want to attribute any value judgment on whether a person is deviant or criminal or anything like that. We're just trying to understand the behavior and how it can be explained in society. Mental illness has gone through a process of deinstitutionalization. There have been a number of state hospitals around the country, beginning in California under the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Mental hospitals were underfunded, they were closed, and those who were mentally ill were put into other settings within society. Some of them would have to live in other residential settings. Some of them would have outpatient treatment. Some would have therapy. Some would be institutionalized. There are people who are still to this day who are criminally ill and are institutionalized and separated from society. There are group homes for people with mental and physical disabilities. There's independent living where people who have mental illness but are able to live relatively independently. And then there is what's known as semi-independent living, where there is some assistance to people with mental illness in society. There is a stigma of mental illness in society, but anyone that has a problem should understand that mental illness is like any other problem in our society. If you have a problem, for example, if you have a physical problem, you go to a doctor. The doctor will prescribe some treatment, some test, some medication for it. The same thing is true for mental illness in society. But a lot of people live with the stigma, and they're treated differently based upon their disabilities, whether it's developmental or mental, or whether it is physical. So the label of being mentally ill is a very powerful label that can result into a stigma that has negative consequences for people who are experiencing something or who are different in society due to no fault of their own. Being socially defined deviant can alter a person's self-concept. There are people that are mentally ill and they're very frustrated because of their inability to perform certain roles and certain activities within society. And it is understandable. And there are some people, though, despite their disability, their mental illness, are able to live well-adjusted lives in society. Mental illness can result in the stigma, and once this stigma of mental illness has taken place, it is hard to resist, and it continues to have consequences for people with mental illness throughout the life course. What are some of the sources of mental illness in this society? There is developmental disabilities, people who are born with certain developmental disabilities. There is what's known as brain trauma, people who have a traumatic experience, an accident, a car accident, or an athletic accident. We have a lot of discussion about concussions today on the football field. These can result in debilitating consequences for people after an accident. And there are factors contributing to mental illness. There are biological factors, there are psychological factors, and there are also environmental factors. So mental illness is a very complex issue in our society. It requires it's interdisciplinary research. People from sociology and psychology and biology all work together to understand the nature and consequences of mental illness in society. Drug addiction is another big problem when it comes to deviance in society. Addictions to drugs, alcohol, tobacco are significant problems in our society. And there are different consequences for the criminalization of these problems, the decriminalization, the legalization and medicalization of these issues. If we criminalize people for drug addiction and put them in jail, what are the consequences for people and for society and for families? People receive little or no treatment, but they're merely punished for their addictions. And we might assume that people who are addicted to drugs, that it is all a choice. Well, at one point it's a choice. At one point when a person takes the first drink or tries marijuana or crack cocaine for the first time, it's a choice. But after a while, once the person has become addicted to the drug is more in control than the individual, and it has less to do with the person's willpower and more to do with the addiction that is now taking place in a person's life that requires some type of treatment, some expert assistance in terms of dealing with the problem of addiction. It's important to consider how we criminalize so many people who are addicted to drugs and the consequences for families, the consequences for society, the consequences for the individuals themselves. And the alternative would be to medicalize these problems and to deal with them in a more constructive way rather than punishing people for being addicted to drugs. We don't punish people for cancer. We don't punish people for having diabetes or heart disease, but we punish people with addictions, which are medical conditions that are beyond the control of the individual to address. So it's very important in society for us to consider our policies and our programs related to drug addiction in society. But drugs are big business. We don't only have a problem of people being addicted to illicit drugs, illegal drugs, controlled substances, but we also have a problem of people being addicted to prescription medications. Some children are prescribed medications at a very early age for things like attention deficit disorder and people for hypertension. We have athletes that are given narcotic pain medications that eventually leads to a dependence upon those drugs. But we have marketing. We have so many commercials on television and other mediums, the internet, about drugs. Ask your doctor about this drug and it will solve all your problems and things like that. But it's important for us to understand the commercial side, the business side of drugs that has consequences for people and for society. They also have side effects that require you to be dependent upon other drugs. And it's important to keep that in mind. Mental illness is also used as a form of social control. Historically, men would label their wives as mentally ill if they were not subservient to their husbands, obedient to their husbands. Children were labeled as deviant, who were disobedient and rebellious and were institutionalized. And so the label of mental illness can be abused in our society and can be nothing more than a form of social control. Homosexuality as deviance in society. Homosexual Americans are more likely to be labeled deviant in society. Those with a same-sex orientation can be assumed to violate the norms of society. Today, we have the legalization of same-sex marriage. However, the label and the stigma of people who are homosexual, bisexual, and LGBT that we continue to have to wrestle with how to address this issue in our society. Heterosexuality is the norm within our society. Most people in society identify themselves as heterosexual. However, we do have people in society with same-sex orientations and are often labeled deviant, and there are consequences for those labels for people and for society. I finally want to talk about alternative lifestyles when it comes to deviance. We have a number of subcultures in our society that are identified as different lifestyles that people choose in society. They have different values, different beliefs, different behaviors, different styles of dress, different music, things like hip hop music that has its own. I hope you will look at some of the pictures that I have on this particular slide concerning alternative lifestyles. You have hippies, you have punk, you have gothic, you have jocks, you have Trekkies, you have preppers, you have all these different subcultures within society that represent a deviant subculture or deviant subcultures within our society. There was one I just learned the other day. It's called emo. Emo is where you have the people who cover one side of their face and they're sort of shy, and it has to do with their emotions. It has to do with people that are more introverted within society. And all of these are a part of the various subcultures and what's referred to as deviant cultures of society. I hope you'll do the exercise that I have on that slide, that you'll try to identify the picture with the type of alternative lifestyle on the left-hand side. Have any questions? Email me, dmonk@se.edu.